welcome back to the channel. Another interview today. I am joined by archaeologist and historian AJ Dair, whose current research looks at the mental health of rulers from the past, including our friend Henry VIII. With a background in archaeology in the southeastern US and a lifelong passion for European history, AJ has been exploring how psychology and history intersect. In this conversation, we talk about the challenges of looking at a king like Henry through a modern psychological framework, how his childhood, health, and even accidents, jousting accidents, shaped him, and what we can learn when we reconsider famous rulers, not just as monarchs, but as actual people. So just a note, AJ is one of our Tudorcon 2025 speakers, so this is a little preview of her talk that she'll be giving at Tudorcon. You can, of course, still get a couple of in-person tickets are left, not a lot, but a couple. And you can always come from anywhere in the world through Tudorcon from home. So englandcast.com/Tudorcon from home to learn about those streaming tickets, englandcast.com/Tudorcon to come in person. All right, let's get into it with me asking AJ about her background in archaeology and how she got into looking at the mental health aspects of rulers.
Well, I'm mostly an archaeologist. That's my day job. And so, of course, I've always really been into history. I'm colonial, but I do love European history. I'm a little bit more self-taught in that area. But the Tudors have always been like a first love for me. Henry is a little bit of my obsession. Um, so I feel like I've spent a lot of time reading about him, learning about him, and as I went through my historian side now, I'm starting to get into writing. I've been doing a little bit of research for other people, and now I'm doing my own. And I just find the mental aspect of different rulers very fascinating. I know I didn't really start with Henry. It was actually more Caligula that got me into the psychology of everything. But then I kind of moved on. And of course, with Henry being my number one favorite historic figure, I just kind of dove into that. And yeah.
What kind of archaeology do you do?
Well, right now I'm in Florida, so I do mostly the southeastern part of the United States. It's a lot of pre-contact, Spanish colonial, British colonial aspects and stuff. Yeah, it's pretty much all that's here right now.
Interesting. Okay, now, and I know that, like, you got me with Caligula because that could be its own series. Like,
Yes, I like the aspect of the psychology because you never really know. Like with him, was he or wasn't he? Was it exaggerated to slander him? Did he really have some of these issues? Is it a blend of both? Maybe. It's a lot of speculation, but it's a lot of fun to dive into.
interesting. All right. So, like, there's a lot of times people have opinions and thoughts, and they'll say, like, oh, Henry was a narcissist, or, this or that. Like, how do you balance using, like, modern psychological ideas and frameworks without diagnosing somebody from the past unfairly? And I have a part two with that question, too, which is that often it seems like once you name something, it becomes more of a thing. So, like, whereas we might have depression, they might have called it melancholia or something like that, or just bad humors. Like, do you think this gets quite philosophical, but do you think that changes? Do you think it's the same thing with both names, or do you think that the name can change it? This is getting really sidetracked, but kind of, well, let's start with the first half. How do you avoid putting modern frameworks on somebody 500 years ago that's not even here?
Well, it's really delicate. It's you got to be very careful with that. I think it is easy to see everything through a modern lens when it comes to stuff like that, especially health and not even just mental health, but even just like physical illnesses and stuff. There's a lot of speculations on diabetes and syphilis and Kel positive and all this different stuff that we'll like never really know. And it's kind of the same for mental issues as well. So you want to be careful coming at it from the modern perspective. We have a lot of different terms that and ideas that, of course, they would not have been aware of back then, or maybe they would have had a slight inkling, like you said, with like the melancholia and different things. That's just their form of what we would know as depression now, So like they were kind of aware and they were I don't know. They did have some ideas of it, but it's not as much as today. And I mean, even if you look at modern times now, it's only been more recent that we actually started to dive into mental issues and taking them a little bit more seriously than we have in the past centuries and decades.
Yeah.
So everything is still kind of changing. You don't want to set like solid ideas and judge too harshly based on those ideas. But you do have to blend the modern with the past. You do have to understand their society, their culture, the way they would have thought of things, and how it fits into our framework now.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, I guess, what I was trying to get at is just, so much of our reality lives in language. And like you can create through language, right? Like the United States of America doesn't exist other than language. We put these lines here. And so then we say, and now there's a country. And I guess I just wonder, like, they had different language, different terms for understanding things, a whole different worldview and different framework. And I kind of want to get at, like, would narcissism be different based on like their understanding of what, even if they might have had something that was like, okay, this is what they might call it. Do you think it might have manifested? Do you think some of these mental conditions might have manifested themselves in different ways just based on their different ways of understanding? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, no, it does. And it's hard to say because stuff like narcissism or like borderline personality disorder, more personality disorders. I don't think they had like I'm sure they had an idea of arrogance and whatnot, but I don't think they had a true concept of those so much as they did maybe like depression or even the more obvious like madnesses that they would label the ones that and are very obvious to them. But as far as like in the reference to King Henry VIII, if we look at based on like narcissism or even personality disorders of that nature, I think you would have a subset of people who would have just seen him as a king. That's what kings do. This is his right. Of course he's going to be arrogant. God chose him. But then there's probably another subset, especially people who did not live in England and were freer to maybe vocalize what they were truly thinking of Henry, that would say, well, there's something wrong with him. Look at what he's doing with his wives. He's breaking away from the Catholic Church and just all these extremes.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So looking back on, there's a lot about how he was raised and how close he was to his mother and having been a second son and all of that. Which part of his background do you think would have weighed most heavily on him, or like some of his very earliest influences that would have had the biggest psychological impact on him?
I definitely think it would have been the treatment he received. I mean, from an early age, I know he was living separate, of course, as most of the children do from course, but from an early age, he was raised just being told that he was special, like more so than everyone else. Of course, that's going to do something to your mind. And even I know he was close to his mother. Her death did impact him a lot, and especially the shift with his father afterwards, especially after Arthur had passed away as well. His father became very protective. This is a good word for how he treated him. So it was probably a huge shift from what he was used to, a little bit more indulgence and a little bit more freedom. But definitely early years, I think, were huge. We have a lot of recorded information from even Thomas More and a few other figures that just talk about how just praising how smart he is and how outgoing and how precocious. And then, of course, as he got older, he was just so handsome. And so everything was just these glowing descriptions of him that I'm sure he heard constantly. And that's really going to shape how you feel about yourself in the world.
Yeah, when you're told that you're God's chosen person, and
Yes. And then, even with his brother passing away, he was the second son. So I'm sure he felt extra, like I'm not sure. We don't really have a record of how he felt about his brother's death, but he must have felt even more so like God chose me. I was the second son. I shouldn't have been king, and yet here I am. So,
yeah. And so then we now today understand a lot of our mental health comes from physical health too, like exercise and endorphins, all that kind of stuff, and all the different chemicals that we eat and things and how that can affect mental health. So what do you think about like his physical issues that he had? Like there's like you said, a lot of speculation, but he definitely had his ulcers and, possibly diabetes and obesity and all of that. How do you think that that played into his decision making and to his mindset?
I think that played in like a huge role, especially in the later years when they really started to pop up. When he was young, he was so active and just kind of kept himself busy. And I think that played a big part in seeing that maybe jovial, fun loving type guy that masks a little bit of the early signs of these things. But when he had his accident in 1536 with the jousting, and there's no doubt that it probably did cause some kind of traumatic brain injury, whether it just be something as mild as concussion or something even more lasting. But that time period really is like a nexus for him where the ulcers start, the weight gain starts. I feel like the whole situation with Anne Boleyn was kind of coming to its end course there, all that he did to marry her, and it didn't really turn out how he expected. So I think it's just started this turning point of maybe him realizing things are changing, things he can't handle, things he can't control. And especially for someone like him who believes that like his touch is healing, he probably can't understand what is happening to my leg. Why am I getting sick? The obesity, he can't go out and be physical. I'm sure that does a lot to someone's mind.
Yeah, I'm sure. So let's talk about that jousting accident because that 1536 really, like you said, seems like a nexus for him. Were there, I think about the earlier signs, how he like executed Buckingham 1521, I think that was, or right around in there. I could be wrong on that date, but like he did have these tendencies earlier to execute family members and all of that.
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder like, were there always signs there, or do you think 1536 just really kicked it into overdrive? What do you think about that year?
Well, I think there are definitely signs before that. I think even more positive signs starting even as a child, some of the outgoing things, some of the more uh, exuberant things that he did were just signs, even though they seem more like positives, they still indicate something else is like going on under the surface. And then, of course, we do know that he was executing people prior to those times. We start off with his reign executing his father's advisors, Epstein and Dudley.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, Epson, excuse me. And yeah, so he starts there. We know that he executed people for religious reasons. There's some social dissent that he squashed, of course. We know that right away he wanted to go off to France and have these battles and just think of himself this way. So I think there were signs. And not only that, people did record that even though he was so good natured, there were times where his emotions could just change on a whim, and suddenly he would just be incredibly wrathful out of like nowhere, or well, for them it felt like nowhere, but I'm sure he had some logic to it. But yeah, so there were these hidden signs, and then I think, of course, that injury really did not help. Yes, we do know that traumatic brain injuries, damage to the frontal lobe or the cortex system, they really do change your personality a little bit. So if you already had those symptoms, it would exacerbate them or just, kind of unmask them really to a degree that people were not expecting.
Gotcha. And then you put on top of that the lack of being able to do the things he wanted to do and the pain and would have gotten really not very fun.
Yes. And I think too, even when Anne started to come along, we start to see this change in his early reign. They really wanted to give him what he wanted. It was easier for him to get the things he wanted. But then I feel like when Anne came along and he wanted to separate and he wanted to divorce Catherine and all these different things, he started to hear no a little bit more and a little bit more pushback. And I think that also brought out a little bit of the hidden side of him as well.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So when you look at his relationships with his wives, with his ministers and all the different people, without actually diagnosing him in an official sense, what kinds of things does it point to for you?
Well, I find the relationships are actually one of the most important parts because it really does show these changes of emotions that he goes through. He really starts off very, especially with his wife, with Catherine and with Anne, you see this attachment and this almost, you would say it would be love if you didn't see how he switches partway through the relationships. But some of the personality disorders, they do come with symptoms of just this lack of empathy for people. They're there to bolster yourself, you know? So once they're not doing that anymore, they're not of use to you. You don't have this attachment to them. You don't really care about their feelings in that regard. And even with like borderline personality disorder, we do see something called splitting, which is where you have this it's a difference in relationships where you just see the person as either all good or all bad. And so with a lot of them, I find that they're all good when they're doing what he wants and things are going well. And the moment that they are not doing what he wants or they're not achieving the goals that he desires, like having a son, or even with Cromwell, you know, getting him out of the Anne of Cleves debacle, suddenly they're all bad and they have to go because they're just in the way. And it's just a huge shift.
Yeah. Do people actually believe that, or is it like a tool that they use to justify their actions in their own head? Do you think that like even now with you said that it's called splitting, like do people actually do they when you get inside their head, like would Henry have really thought like, okay, this person is all bad now? Do you think?
I mean, it's hard to say what was going on in his head and the actual thoughts. I mean, without him documenting it in some way. But I mean, you just see with the quickness of the downfall, like with Anne and with Cromwell, I mean, it was pretty swift when he decided they needed to go. They went pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I know Catherine, I feel like she would have went pretty quick too if she hadn't, you know, fought and held on to herself, which of course made him
Yeah.
probably view her as even worse than a lot of them. But I think in his head, I'm sure that afterwards there would be some good that he would see because we even hear how he regrets, you know, the execution of Cromwell. But again, it was just that impulsivity that comes with it that you just don't think about the consequences until after the fact.
I was thinking about, I think there's a quote that he said something about that he was thinking about his son, Henry Fitzroy, after Anne's fall, that he said they were so lucky that Anne didn't get to him, Henry Fitzroy, like as if he was actually like really afraid. And I read it somewhere. I forget now where it was, like if it was it was in an Alison Weir book, and I forget if it was like historical fiction or fiction. So somebody will tell me if I'm wrong. But like I feel like there was like this sign that people said points to that he actually really believed that Anne was dangerous and that he had really escaped. And look how lucky he was for having gotten away from her. And it makes me think when you mentioned the splitting, I thought about that because it seemed like for a while he actually quite possibly did believe she was dangerous and he had been lucky to get away from her. And
Yes. And it also kind of goes back to like even what he believed of her, you know? I mean, he went from being so madly in love with her to believing that she slept with her own brother and,
right.
you know, just all these crazy things that I think nowadays, of course, would not fly. But back then, if he didn't believe those things, then the problem might have been a little bit on him. And he was never going to think that he was the problem.
Right.
So,
Of course. Of course. How, so you mentioned that people in England couldn't say stuff obviously about him, but people in other countries, I know there's like the famous Christina of Milan saying if she had two heads, he'd be welcome to have one. I wonder, like, are there other mentions that you found of what other contemporaries thought about Henry? Have you come across anything like that? What do you think other people thought?
yeah, there's a few, I believe, especially, you know, people whose families were affected back in England who maybe had to flee and were abroad and such. I know that they would have claims like that. I know that I've read even the French king has kind of made his comments about the whole, how like, you know, the marriages and even in England, there was a woman who even made the comment and got in trouble saying like, well, how many wives will he have? You know, so like, there are a few, and then of course one of the sources that I really enjoy is Nicholas Sanders, and I kind of forget where he came from, and I think he was a little bit after the fact, but his his writings on Henry are just, you could tell he did not like him. Everything is just so negative. So I think there are contemporary figures that, of course, we're wondering, like, what is this man doing? And like, what is going on? But of course, being king, they're going to humor him a lot more than they would the average person.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. Do you think thinking that he might have been dealing with mental health issues or things like that, do you think having that framework to look at it through gives us any space for more understanding of his victims and also even like I hate to say like empathy for him, empathy for the people around him, more just a deeper understanding of what was actually happening as opposed to just putting this label bad, good kind of thing on it?
Yeah, it's hard to say in regards to that because I think there is a lot of empathy, especially now for what we would say is victims. I know, especially in modern times, Anne Boleyn has become a figure that people really understand a lot better now, and enjoy hearing more of her aspect of it. I do find that for him, a lot of his actions can be seen as so negative, especially towards those later years and the executions, and it's all just kind of for his selfish goals. So I think it maybe takes away a little bit of the empathy for him. But again, given the society he was raised in and the beliefs that they held, like it's hard to fault anyone with maybe his behavior and how things played out because I that's just how a king was gonna be treated, especially in this time period.
Right, right. Yeah, it's hard because you look at somebody like that and you think, well, they were horrible, they were a monster. And then I was just thinking, like, if they were battling these mental health things that they didn't even have words to put to, or they didn't even know, like, I just wonder if that gives more space for grace without obviously accepting what they did, because what they did was still horrible. And so you're not going to make excuses for that, but just kind of thinking, like, maybe it wasn't just monster Henry. It's hard because, like, I kind of think it was. But like
Well, and a lot of people do, even when I talk about this subject with people and I tell them that I'm researching, I get, especially for people who aren't really into the Tudors, I get a lot of like, oh, that guy was crazy. Like
right.
clearly he was crazy. And it's just this people are so ready to write it all off. But there's so many nuances that you have to look at. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just that's, like, my thing personally is, like, building empathy through the past. Because like, if you can look back and really try to understand why the reasons why somebody was doing something, and you can do it from the distance of 500 years without maybe the same emotional charge that you might have looking at things today, maybe you can, like, practice that muscle a little bit and then, like, start to see people today who might believe different things from you and say, "Okay, well, like, maybe I can see why they might believe that, and it's not what I believe, but maybe I see why they believe that." And I guess I just wonder, like, as you look at some of these people and their psychological profiles, have you had any moments where you've been kind of surprised at having a deeper understanding of somebody?
Yeah, I think it does give you a lot of perspective, especially on and maybe even surprisingly, maybe more the celebrity culture as well, because I do find people are very far removed. I mean, it has been hundreds of years. And so there is this tendency to think of them as more like a story. We see them we see Tudor movies and shows, and it's very dramatic and glorified and all these different things. Oh, it just zoomed down on me.
Oh, look at no, that was interesting.
um, but yeah, to maybe think of it more in this sensationalized way and kind of forget the humanity of it all. Like these were real people living their lives and they were just trying to survive under the reign of this guy who really just was the power. And it kind of it reminded me a little bit his life of even how we treat maybe like celebrities. I mean, you hear these stories, people think they're there for like their own fueling purposes. You kind of forget to give them that human aspect, especially when they also start to maybe have mental breakdowns and issues. And it becomes this national story with no regard for what's actually going to happen to them. And that's when you see, unfortunately, things like they could pass away, they fall from this limelight just to try and get away from the publicity of it all. And yeah, and you just forget that they're people.
Like Britney Spears, man, she just such breaks my heart. But
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good one. And even too, I think I was hearing about little Nas X or whatever. They just found him walking, and they're not sure what kind of scenario that is. And people are so quick to jump to like he was on drugs. He was like all this assumption, and yeah,
You don't know.
and it's the same for past figures, and of course they're dead, so they're never going to be able to speak for themselves. So it's all speculation and assumption.
Yeah, and then when you're looking at it, not only are you looking at it from the remove of 500 years, but you're looking at it through then the filter of 500 years worth of people putting their own interpretations on it. So that by the time we get to it, we're looking at it through the lens of the Victorians, who were looking at it through the lens of, the Georgians, and like all of these people had their own interpretations, and then we need to like try and break through all of that to see what was actually happening. And so how does one break away from like these preconceived ideas to actually, when you're looking at these people, how do you break away from, say, so much of what we know or what we think we knew about Anne Boleyn came from like Agnes Strickland or like the Victorians? Like, how do you break through that and just see the person?
Well, it's actually I find it's pretty difficult, I'm not gonna lie, and especially, because you have to understand the nuances of every source, like you said, the Victorians and all this, like, you have to understand their society to see where they're coming from when they talk about these topics, or else you're gonna kinda miss the mark a little bit, and, um, and so I find it's really focusing on what they believed when they were talking about it and trying to strip away that and just look at the facts, you know what I mean? And again, going back so far, it is a little hard. You're gonna have to use so many different resources to maybe see who's saying what. And sometimes one resource says one description and the other has something completely different. So you don't even know like what is fact and what is fiction, what's made up after the fact, what was actually witnessed.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of layering basically, and trying to again just remember the human side of it. Try to remember that obviously they're not going to be as I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for right is, but yeah, it's
Nobody's
just
black and
like
white.
he's not a monster, you know what I mean? Like and Anne Boleyn's not all good, not all bad. It's so many different nuances and layers to it.
It's almost like everybody's just human and people have good sides and not so good sides.
Exactly.
Crazy. So like how do you what do you think is the importance of looking at rulers' mental health? You looked at Caligula and Henry and like what kind of why do you think that's an important lens to look at history through and to understanding the period?
Well, obviously they're the leaders. A lot of what they say kind of goes. They're the ones who lead the direction for their countries, and it's hard to say. Some of them have not as much impact as others. I know we know like going back to Caligula, like we hear a lot about him, and he of course was an emperor in a society where he did have a lot of control, and he when he wanted them to do some interesting things, they had to go and do it. But if we look at other figures that have been kind of known for madness or whatnot, like if we look at like Henry VI prior to relation to Henry VIII, he had his issues, his oh my gosh, I can't speak, catatonic state that he went into, and he was deposed. You know what I mean? Like they saw him as a weaker leader, so he led to the War of Roses and stuff. And so
Sure.
even though he wasn't that strong of a leader, you do see the effects in it in itself. We led to him losing his kingship, and then you know, and then even with Henry, Henry VIII, everything he says goes. If he wanted to go to war with France, they went to war. If they had to fight Scotland, they had to fight Scotland. So it really just depends on the leader. So some of them, their times, their madness, their issues kind of take center stage and really do affect a lot of lives. Whereas other ones, it's not so much.
Yeah. Have you ever looked at George III, right? There was the movie The Madness of King George too, I think I remember. Yeah, like have you looked at him? This is totally off topic, but I'm just curious.
I mean, I am a little bit aware of him, not too much. I haven't done as much research into him, but even with him, the one thing I do know is that he had his lucid periods, So there would be times where he would just be, again, just a person, and he would wonder like what was happening to him when he was not lucid, and like why is this happening, and like what. So he had an awareness of it, that, certain times other people don't. Like, obviously, Henry VIII wouldn't have had an awareness of most of it, but we do see in his how he liked to make his medicines. He kind of compiled a little book of medicines and stuff, especially in his later years, where he was using ingredients that would fight off melancholia and bring about cheerfulness. So he had to have some realization that, I am not as cheerful as I used to be, something like that.
Interesting. Well, I'm super interested to see your talk at Tudorcon. Where else? Tell me about where else. Like you said, you're working on publishing this stuff. I say this work. Tell me about where people can learn more about you and your work.
Well, right now I'm not really anywhere. My job as an archaeologist does take up a
Yeah,
lot of my time.
sure.
This would be my first publication, so I am trying to get out there. And then I know I kind of do want to start like a little series, maybe by the end of the year that just it's like a quick blurb looking into different figures and their mental state and whether it's founded or not founded or you know just different variations of that.
So interesting. Like I could see that getting popular on like TikTok or something. And then I just thought like the idea of having like a 2 minute, 1 minute, 2 minute video on someone's mental state on an app that's not always great for your mental state. Like there just seems something very meta about that whole thing. Like I'm just like, is that what the world has come to where we're looking at nuances in 2 minutes on an app? That was funny, but I could see it getting really popular.
Yeah, that would actually probably be very popular. I was exact.
I could see that too. Anyway, well, look, I said we would do it for half an hour and I've gone 3 minutes over. So thank you for
Oh
your
wow.
curiosity and for sharing all of your research with us. I'm super excited to see your talk at TudorCon and to meet you. And it was really nice to talk to you now. I'm really getting excited for your talk and for meeting you and everything. So just thank you for taking the time.
All right, and thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, it's been great. It's been great.